In the face of something that's an earthquake and it's actually sort of a risk to human life and it's a civil defence emergency, you do start to question what's the value of doing an art project in this situation. What's the point of jewellery in an earthquake?
I did feel quite safe, and I knew it was huge, but it wasn't until I looked out the window and saw all the dust that you see and then the look on people's faces, and I just knew in that moment, wow, this is big, this is serious. It's really funny because I distinctly remember as I was stepping out the door that day, there was a crack that went just absolutely perfectly from left to right across the floor, and I stepped over the crack and I looked at the crack and I thought, wow, that's me out of here. It was so amazing to be part of an area that was growing and changing, and that was exciting. It was so hard to be hit by something like an earthquake at that time, where I had all this, it was a ridiculous amount of energy, actually too much energy. And that's why I couldn't cope, because I thought, my God, I was ready to really just instigate all these changes, and perhaps slow changes, but there was still that feeling of heaps of energy behind it, and then to suddenly have that sort of pulled down, I thought, my God, I can't, I thought I was going to explode. What am I going to do? I can't stay in this town where there is no business, where there is no CBD. I always talked about Host to Brooch being my anchor. It was an anchor in the sense that I committed to... it was a long-term project. We were busy Skyping and planning and putting in funding applications from sort of March, and the project didn't actually open until August, so that was quite a long period of work. And of course it was unpaid work, but it was something to focus on, something really positive. It was working in collaboration with an artist, and that's not something that you can do when you're running a gallery.
Most people's sort of understanding of jewellery is it's about identity or self-expression and that kind of thing. And I guess what I'm sort of interested in thinking about is, if you have these sort of objects and you attach them to the body, how do they affect us? What do they do? It made me conscious of the colours in the demolition. Beforehand, I had just thought everything was shades of grey. Machines, dust, rubble. But the brooch made me aware of the red cranes, the yellow diggers, and the colours of spring. I'm doing a practice-based PhD, and my project's about exploring how the process of jewellery, including both the making process and the wearing of it, affects people's relations with their surroundings. And I'm specifically interested in urban surroundings, and because that's where we often find ourselves to be. And I think that's a little bit of a reaction to perhaps the tradition of New Zealand contemporary jewellery, which is this sort of idealised nature or the domestic. So, the urban surroundings in some ways are the most confronting ones to deal with. I arrived for the June earthquake and I was there for that one. I was with a friend who lives in Sumner. We were just sort of busy, enjoying ourselves, and then the really big one happened and I just sort of ran outside, thinking, I'm running for the glass doors, what am I doing? And we were in Sumner, so right opposite the RSA, so all the cliffs were just like raining down and all the cars were bouncing in the car park. When I was a kid, I was in the Edgecombe earthquake, so I actually have had a quite long-term phobia of earthquakes. So going back there for, several trips and being there for a long period of time, waiting for another big one, I knew there'd be another big one. I actually really had to do a lot of my own philosophical thinking about, how do I actually come to terms with this situation so that I can keep going on. I guess one of the really key ideas in my PhD that I should explain for a moment is I use this analogy of a saprophyte, which is an organism. In ecosystems, they break down decomposing matter and then they allow the nutrients to go back into the ecosystem. So that's how I think of jewellery in relation to its context. It's absorbing materials, transforming them, and then feeding them back into that context. We found out pretty much the first day that we went to gather materials that there's a really stringent mandate on taking materials, so you can't take anything without written permission. So what we did was we sort of started talking to people to try and find out where the trucks were taking the materials. So we sort of located these demolition yards on the edge of town and went out there. And it was a really remarkable experience. Like, I think, if anything, when you go to a particular site and you see a building falling down, it's really easy to get caught up in the human stories of that specific location, who was there, and the whole human sentimental side of it kind of overshadows everything else. But when you went to these sites on the edge of town, it's just these mountains of material.
There were pieces of barrier mesh, bright orange barrier mesh that was just sticking out of this huge, big, white, dusty pile of other parts of the building. There's just this bright orange, and that was another wonderful image. There was, burnt floorboards that Jacqui made into a very beautiful brooch, actually. Pieces of different signs that had been broken and smashed. Also, it was sort of like I sort of described it like being a big digestive system of the city. And so you're sort of seeing actually the city operating at a different level of just all of this matter, that's been transformed. So, yeah, it was quite a striking kind of experience, actually. And for me, it wasn't that, these are broken buildings. It was, wow, these are Canterbury's native forests, just seeing so much native timber all piled up and broken. So it sort of really was very, very clear, that history of the materials, which is really important for the way I think about how the city is. So the overall project for Host a Brooch was, the point was to test these transformed things that have emerged from that urban environment, what the effect is on people and the way that they relate or connect or interact with their urban surroundings. Anybody could come, so it wasn't, a specific invitation, and they could take a brooch out for 2 hours. And they were asked to they were quite specifically briefed. They were given a little user manual, and I was articulating it that just to notice the aspects of their surroundings that the brooch drew attention to. Sort of what I quite liked, the way she described it often, was that to use the brooch as a lens. You'd use the brooch and almost look through the brooch at the environment and see where that took you. And it sort of slowed you down. That's what I found was wonderful. Actually, a lot of people came back very relaxed, quite happy. It was very interesting seeing how people came and how they left. There were a few people who came back quite disturbed. They'd perhaps found it too difficult going into the inner city. They perhaps hadn't been before, or it too confronting. I remember we had one woman say that she was used to, since the earthquake, only focusing on the positive and only seeing the good things, the flowers sprouting up in the empty spaces, everything that was happy and sort of like everything's fine, we'll ignore the rest. And she had the complete opposite experience, so she found her brooch wearing quite challenging, and it made her feel quite upset. I guess overall I was a little bit surprised. I was anticipating that it could be quite an emotional experience for people. There's a photo of a girl sitting in a digger bucket, wearing the brooch. There's people who covered themselves in materials, who were lying in amongst the bushes. And so it was really interesting that the project as a whole, not necessarily the brooch in isolation, but the project sort of gave them permission to occupy and interact with the city in a different way. And I think out of maybe 245 wearers, I think there was about 3 who reported having quite a confronting, not negative experience, but quite a emotionally moving experience. And on the whole, other people were actually kind of enlivened, invigorated, and, quite sort of adventurous about taking part. So I was surprised about that. I didn't really expect that. It just actually reconfirmed that it's so important to have creative responses in those times. I looked up. I was amazed at what I had not seen before. The brooch gave me a different perspective of the city, and I was surprised how much of the city remained. I had a curator the other day looked me in the eye and said, "Why did you continue?" And I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, that's such a direct obvious question, but it sort of stopped me in my tracks for a minute. But one thing that comes to mind is because I haven't finished yet. And there's that sort of feeling that, I've still got the energy and the drive and the passion for what I do that even the earthquake hasn't managed to sort of, squish.